Thank you for being here. My name is Alex Witt, and I'm delighted to be helping with this business in the ballots. Just so you know, in my broadcasts in the United States on MSNBC, I like to encourage discussion and dissension. So while I may pose a question to one of the esteemed panelists here, if anyone else wants to jump in there and add your thoughts, please do so. I would love to say that we will have time at the end, but I think the likelihood for questions of that is pretty slim to none, given these four great minds who are going to talk about a number of different issues. And I think this is a very timely issue for this particular conference because, as many of you know, tomorrow marks the 5th anniversary of the US emerging from recession officially. That was when the GDP data showed an annual growth rate of 3.5% in the third quarter of 2009. I'm going to ask my partner in crime back there, Annette, who will be bringing up these slides to do so, and show that first slide, number 35, that I wanted to demonstrate that. And that'll be followed by corporate profits at a record high, slide number 18, which will back this up. What has happened in the 5 years since. The first question I want to ask the panelists, though, is where is the US economy right now today? Not everybody is going to agree with particularly this second slide, that corporate profits are great. Sure, the corporate folk will do that, but not on Main Street. So I guess I'm going to ask this of you first, Ross, because you are Milken's chief research analyst, and your thoughts on that, on where the US economy is today.
Well, I think the U.S. economy is really poised to hit escape velocity. How would I define that? When you're growing at about a 2% annual rate, there's always some exogenous event that can take you back down. But once you start approaching 3% real GDP growth in the U.S., I think it starts hitting a sustainable level. So the last half of 2013, the average growth rate was 3.3%. It was the strongest 6-month period in 10 years in the United States. And then, of course, we had the first quarter, which showed a decline of 2.2% in annual rate, which really raised a lot of alarms. In retrospect, it really was largely weather-related and an inventory correction from the buildup in the second half of 2013. I guess I'm the cautious optimist. I think that the U.S. has hit escape velocity. We've seen consumer debt burdens decline quite significantly. We've seen job growth averaging this year 237,000 a month. That's a sustainable rate. And I think more importantly, businesses are feeling more confident that they're willing to make large capital expenditures. I remember back in April at our global conference, we had the CEO of Siemens North America, and in one of the conference calls where we find out a lot of important information about what's going on, he told us that his orders were up 20% from the same period last year. And that was one of the key ingredients, corporate America, boards of directors having the confidence to make major investments. So I think with the decline in oil prices and lower gasoline prices, that puts a lot of discretionary spending power back in consumers' pockets. And one of the areas that really hasn't hit on all cylinders yet has been the housing market. I think there's still some restraints in mortgage finance that are holding that back. But overall, I think the U.S. economy can be the rudder that steers the global economy in the right direction. Or, given that I used to be a chief economist at a railroad, it's the locomotive that pulls the rest of the world along, is my analogy. So I think the U.S. is poised for about 3%, maybe a little bit better than 3% growth over the next 6 months to a year. And we can take that baton that, slow down in China and the threat of a triple dip recession in Europe.
I want to pick up on the housing issue and speak to you, Jean, about that, because I know that you've had some questions about the tight lending practices. And Annette, if you'll have slides 26 through 29, you can just roll those in as we show where the housing market is right now. Talk about that, and because let's face it, that was the epicenter of the problem by most accounts. The housing bubble burst. People who were not qualified were getting loans for exorbitant amounts, and it collapsed.
Well, there's no question the practices that led up to the housing crisis were horrific and caused immense pain. And I think as we see terrible thing about a financial crisis is not only is the crisis so painful, but the recoveries aren't as strong too, because when things get better, people are more deleveraging than spending. I think that what's I'm going to say is going to seem a little counterintuitive, which is that I actually think today in the economy, though, that you probably have a credit box that's too tight on housing. And why do I say that? You would not want to go back to the practices that led to the bubble. So one thing you can do is compare what is happening now compared to before the bubble even started. And if you look at that, you would find that FICO scores are 40 plus points higher than they were before the crisis started, looking at a typical Fannie or Freddie mortgage. And the same on the FHA loans. Now that's almost counterintuitive, because the truth is that you'd expect some people to have a little harm to their FICO scores that are unrelated to their personal credibility when you've gone through a great depression. So the question is why? Why are people, even with Fannie and Freddie loans, being so hesitant to make loans that meet the qualifications, even when they have a 100% guarantee? And I'll probably sound a little more like Eric in this answer than me. But I think that this is a case where you have too much regulatory uncertainty. And here's where the uncertainty comes from. People are very afraid that after they give a mortgage, that Fannie or Freddie are going to take away the guarantee. If it goes bad, they're going to put it back to them. So the phrase you hear all the time in the US on this is put back risk. Now, sometimes you can say, well, that's just spin. It's not just spin. You hear it everywhere in the housing market. So the reason why I have a little more optimism that this is going to get better is, I won't bore everybody who doesn't know the housing, but we're starting to get a little more regulatory uncertainty. The qualified mortgage and the QRM are coming together and are going to be done. And secondly, I think that you're finally seeing the FHFA do what they should have done a while ago, which is try to give more certain rules on, one, if a mortgage is good for 3 years, you're off the hook. If somebody paid for 3 years, there's no chance Fannie or Freddie will put that back. And then to the degree that if there's an exception for fraud, it has to be very well defined. And then third, that you don't put it back, you don't put back it for non-material loans. So why is this important? If you just had typical FICO scores, Moody's estimates that you would have over 0.5% more growth. So there's some interesting things going on that may be structural, about young people not wanting to be heads of households as much and start new homes. But there is no question, if we could get more housing certainty, just based on typical numbers, you could have an extra 400,000 new units. You could have another 400,000 or 500,000 new jobs. So this is another potential place for growth in the economy, where if you just returned to normal housing finance practices, you could have another boost that could help you really hit that 3% growth number that's been so elusive for us.
Yeah. Can I say one thing, Alex? I think that Gene is right about what he just said. I'd like to give you dissension, but not on this topic. But I think that there's an underlying problem, and even as FHFA tries to get it right, there are so many different constituencies who want to appeal to voter anger, who want to oversee or look over the shoulder and find any problem they can find in something related to mortgages. So it's the aftermath. The crisis may be 5 years behind us, but in the public's eye, their thirst for appropriate judgment on people has not been satisfied. Mm-hmm. And you see, in the UK, for example, they've been much tougher on banking compensation and things of that nature, to show the public that bankers are not going to get rich taking advantage of people. In the US, I think they've decided that we really don't want to keep these institutions from functioning, so we're going to be a little less tough on them, but let's keep showing how many times we can fine them for something they did wrong in housing. Mm. And when you're an institution like B of A, who's I think been put up a total of $75 billion in fines, and you don't know whether it's going to be Fannie and Freddie, or you don't know whether it's going to be an attorney general or somebody else who says, if I can catch them doing something, this is going to really sell well with the public and the voters, is really underlying all of this, and you've got to hope we can get past it somehow.
Yeah. Eric, I'm curious what you think the factors are that have caused the recent decline in the U.S. equity markets, and how much of it is geopolitical? How much of that can you really ascribe to certain specific events? How much of it might be economic valuation?
Well, you know, I think, Alex, there's certainly a lot of emotion that goes into some of these swings up and down on the equity markets. And there's no question that this concept of growth and, you know, as I think Alan or Jean said, elusive, is frustrating, I think, to many investors. Certainly from the business community out there, I think it's the same in Main Street as it is in Wall Street, that there is a frustration that the growth is so anemic at home, but yet, relatively speaking, better than elsewhere. And when you have the geopolitical flare-ups that come about, whether it be Ebola, whether it be the beheadings in ISIS a month or so or two ago, or what's going on in Eastern Europe with Mr. Putin in Ukraine, and what that means to the energy outlook. All of those certainly can provide some concern on the part of investors, and I think it grows the risk premium, if you will, for commitment to growth and allocation of capital. But I think what we're seeing thematically, though, across the board is this sense that although, as was said earlier, the U.S. can be the locomotive, we are a global economy. And if we're not seeing the growth elsewhere, if we're seeing the pullback in China, whether it's a result of the anti-corruption moves, whether that's dispelling some kind of confidence there, whether you see the lackluster economies here in Europe, certainly that does then ripple into what goes on at home and the commitment to growth. So there's no question we could do a lot better, and there's a real frustration right now. I think what you see at home in America, though, is the private sector is trying to do what it can, despite perhaps the risk premium coming out of Washington. Regulation, as Alan and Jean just said, provides a huge risk premium, but yet if you look in our energy space, certainly there's been a challenge of late given the lack of growth prospects, but certainly when it's not on federal lands, you've seen some real initiative in the shale finds in the country, as well as the technology that's come about, even in the healthcare space. The Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare,
ACA.
ACA, it's provided somewhat of a dampening on the outlook for business because of all the uncertainty surrounding its implementation. But yet, you still see folks in the business world moving to private exchanges, trying to create cost efficiencies there, as well as the promotion of health savings accounts and others outside of the ACA and its realm. So I do think that the initiative is there in the country at home. We have sort of a risk premium that's emanating, though, from abroad and these geopolitical events.
So to each of you, I want to ask quickly, just tell me, do you think the U.S. markets have stabilized, or do you think there is still a risk that they will wobble and decline? I mean, what's your just gut reaction to that, Eric?
My gut is I think we're going to see some more instability, volatility, until we can see an establishment of a more growth-oriented trajectory.
Ross?
I predicted just before the volatility happened that we would have it. It's not over yet, although certainly I think when the equity markets decline substantially, you have buyers coming in. So I think there's a bottom, but could we see a 10% further correction? Very easily, given the geopolitical concerns. When you see a beheading on TV, it's hard to go out to the mall and go shopping or buy a new car. Although auto sales are one of the strongest areas of the U.S. economy. That's not generally recognized, but we've had auto sales at the highest level since 2007, before the financial crisis. It's one of the few areas of the economy which has come back.
Okay. Ellen, your thought?
Sure. Part of the reason auto sales have been strong is the fleet got so old, and it is one product that obsolesces, and it's better to replace it than try and hold on to it. But it is a bright spot in the economy. I actually agree with both of them. I think the trend in risk assets is still favorable. So I think that the long-term trend or the intermediate-term trend is still favorable. But I think it has gotten to a stage where there are going to be swings. So increased volatility based on events that can swing people's expectations. We're close enough to full value that there aren't that many people deeply committed to owning them. They're owning them because they don't really, there's a lot of people call this the TINA market. There is no alternative to get return. And so a lot of people are still riding that the best return is there, but they're not so committed to that they can't be shaken out by events. So I think we get a still rising trend, but with enhanced volatility.
And Gina, as I ask you to answer the question, I'd like you to also fold that into you who are somewhat uniquely qualified to give us a look inside the mind of Fed Reserve Chair Janet Yellen. Give me a read on what's going on in her mind right now.
Well, I guess on the equity markets, I'd be looking mostly to Europe. I think most people have baked in the cake that China's going to be in the low 7s. I don't think that should be considered like a surprise. We do have very low gas prices, and everybody's betting low. I understand why. We could talk about that, but I still get nervous because so many things could happen. But I think the biggest variable is, will be fear in Europe, fear of deflation, fear of another recession. And I think that's where, as Eric said, the world's too small, and that will rebound. I think where I think markets will probably be fairly pleased is I think that the Fed will continue to be accommodative for a while. And the reason I say this is that I think that Janet Yellen's really asking kind of two questions. She knows, and we know, the headline numbers on jobs in the United States are very good now, as Ross said. 7.2% dropped to 5.9%. That's a huge drop in a year. Best drop since '84. We're on pace for the best jobs year in the private sector since 1998. However, what I think Janet Yellen's looking at is she's asking two questions. One, when you look under those headline numbers, are there still a lot of scars from the Great Recession? And the second thing she's asking is it cyclical or is it structural? If it's structural, there's not much Fed policy can do. You can ease monetary policy, but if it's all a skills gap, you're not going to do as much. I think that she is finding, and I think anybody looking at the numbers would find, that the numbers underneath the headline numbers are still very weak, but they're getting constantly better. So that suggests, so if you look at three areas, long-term unemployment, the number of people who are working involuntarily part-time, who want to work part-time, who want to work full-time, those numbers, the good news is they're getting a lot better. The bad news is they're still historically high. So what does that, so I think when she looks, she says, if I'm looking at the Fed mandate of full employment, I've got to not just look at the headline number, I have to look at these scars from the Great Recession. Long-term unemployment's a terrible scar. People working part-time who want to work full-time is a terrible scar. And she says, if I do easier monetary policy, is that going to risk inflation? And I think when she sees the numbers coming down, she says, no, it's cyclical enough or there's enough slack in the labor market of those part-time workers who can work full-time that I can continue to be accommodative and actually do good for long-term unemployed and part-time workers. And I'm not going to risk inflation because they also represent the slack that gives the cushion. And I don't think that she's going to press to raise rates until she actually sees those sub-indicators getting better. One, because she cares about full employment, but two, because she thinks they represent enough slack that she can continue to help without a risk of spiraling inflation.
And before we, did you have something on that?
On labor markets, could I have slide 13? I'll be the cautious optimist here. We just hit an important milestone. It's been the missing ingredient in the U.S. recovery, and that's been small businesses willing to hire again. Over the past 12 months, firms with less than 50 employees have accounted for 40% of net job growth. That is greater than the representation of total employment. So small businesses have been reluctant to expand. In some cases, they couldn't get bank loans. In other cases, they didn't want to take the risk. But I think despite all these obstacles, geopolitical risks out there, small business is feeling that if we don't make these incremental investments, we might miss out on a business opportunity, and that hasn't been present thus far in the recovery.
Before we move to what's happening in the United States a week from today, which is the midterms and thus the ballots part of this discussion, quickly I wanted to ask you, Alan, as we spoke about the pullback of equity, do you think that is going to result in a reduced number of M&A activity, or do you think it might have the opposite effect because of the lower valuation?
It's not one answer. It goes to subtext of that, I would say. First of all, the market move, while volatility attracts people every day, a couple hundred points one way or the other, the market hasn't actually moved all that much. So I don't think that it will have a broad effect on M&A activity. As we look forward, a couple of subsets of that. Point number one, small caps have dramatically underperformed large caps. So from an M&A perspective, since large companies more often acquire small companies than the other way around, the relative purchasing power of large caps has now been improved. So that part in and of itself could actually enhance M&A activity to a certain extent. The other thing about large cap stocks not having capitulated as much, you mentioned a slide on record corporate profits, which has been a big driver of this market. And yet, if you went against that, if you looked at a trend on corporate investment or the percentage of profits that are reinvested, it's at the lowest that we've ever seen it in post-World War II. So corporations have had a lot of capital and a lot of cash building up on their balance sheets. In the early stages, the first several years of this, the safest place to go to that was to buy back their own stock. So as they were buying back stock, it was delaying the need to go out and do anything else, M&A activity, et cetera. I think that's kind of run its course. Investors are saying there's not a lot of juice left in that. It's hard to say we're trading at such low historical values that we should be plowing our cash back into buying our own stock. So it says, what are we going to do with it? I think Ross is pointing out that we're seeing a pickup in capital investment, and I think that's the single most important thing that Janet Yellen and anybody could help keep going is single most important thing. The thing that correlates the best to job growth is capital investment. That's what actually drives jobs. And so, and to get wages going, you need capital investment. The reality is, it is just beginning to recover though. Yeah. And it is really early stages, and it's very, it's not broad, it's kind of narrow to the types of companies that Ross mentioned. So we want to nurture that, but the obvious other alternative for large corporations is to look at M&A. And I think that will continue, and I don't think the market is the biggest risk going forward. I think it's Eric's point that the regulatory environment and the administrative environment is potentially very hostile to M&A for U.S. companies. And if we just see what happened recently with this AbbVie transaction, where the Treasury came out, and Gene and I might get some dissension going here, with some interpretations of a law that I thought were quite aggressive. AbbVie looked at them and said, after studying these, we still think the merger we've announced we're more committed to it than ever. And then, I don't know, a few weeks or a month later, they said, we're withdrawing from the deal, and mentioned in their withdrawal political pressure not to do the transaction. And one of my European clients called me and said, when did the US turn into France? I missed the announcement. I thought it was a rule of law country. So there's a lot of unease in boardrooms right now about whether or not the freeze or the view that laws are hard to pass, and therefore the government wants to use its various regulatory authorities to shape the outcomes of some of these events, is the single most chilling thing that I see in boardrooms today.
Which is a great setup to what I'd like to do. And Annette, if you can throw up slide 43, I want to talk about the midterm elections and their impact on policy. And of course, I'm going to go to Eric first with this.
Why? He's an investment banker.
I know, but you know, there's a history. Barring a last-minute surprise, and knowing, of course, that it comes down to voter turnout, and midterm elections are relatively apathetic as compared to the general elections in the alternate years. Do you expect the GOP to gain the majority, a slim one, in the Senate? And the slide that should be up, I can't, well, yeah, that's the one. So what you're seeing there, for all of you who don't have the map of the United States mastered there, toss-up states right now remain Georgia, Iowa, and Kansas. There is an expectation at this point that it may switch from Democratic to Republican hands in West Virginia, Louisiana, Arkansas, Colorado, South Dakota, and Montana, and that would do the trick there. Does it matter, though, Eric, when it comes to policy? How much does it matter who controls the Senate?
Well, first of all, I think elections do have consequences. So we'll stipulate that there will, I think, be a more productive Congress next term if the Republicans take over. Obviously, Alex, you talk about the Senate, but we have a bicameral legislature, and with that, a House and Senate united certainly could be more productive than that which has been, which is one that's divided. So I don't necessarily think, though, that the kinds of reforms that many of us would like to see, and that's those of us on both sides of the political aisle, are necessarily going to be that easy to effect. As you know, the 60-vote rule in the Senate is typically that which is needed. There is an exception, and Gene knows this, in Washington parlance, what's called reconciliation. Alan from his days there as well. But that is a limited number of issues that can fit under what's called reconciliation. And you still ultimately have to have agreement between the parties if you're going to get something done. So if we're talking about tax reform or entitlement reform, spending and debt reform, those are still, or immigration reform, those are still very tall orders given the restrictions that you're under with a divided government in Washington. I do think, though, that there will be a chance to get some things done. If not on the margins, certainly separate and apart from some of those comprehensive reform measures. You could see on the issue of trade, there's a bipartisan sense, I know in the Senate as well as the House, to increase free trade. There are these free trade agreements out there that have not moved. And I think largely due to the partisan balance in Washington that could perhaps be unleashed, which would be a good thing for Europe, for Asia, and us at home. I also think that in the energy space, as you know, the sort of marquee issue has been the Keystone XL pipeline, which is a cross-border issue between us and Canada. Bipartisan support, it's a job generator, probably something that the Congress could get done, and then the President would have to decide whether he'd reverse his position on that. There are also some other things in terms of domestic pipeline permitting streamlining that I think maybe you could see get done. There's some things in the healthcare space in response to some of the things that have not worked under the ACA that perhaps you could see some movement on, whether it's the 30-hour work week going back to 40 hours, whether it's repeal of the medical device tax. These are the kinds of things, Alex, I think you could see a Congress step up and get done.
And I'm going to ask you to answer this and then Gene answer it as well, because I also want Gene to talk about corporate tax reform, something that he thinks actually is not a huge lift. It could get done with a few things in 2015. But given that this is the president's last 2 years in office, he's facing never again in his lifetime an election, how much do you think he will be willing to work with potentially a Republican Congress, House, Senate, everything Republican? Well, he's got a legacy to shape.
Well, I'm going to let Gene answer what the
mindset may be a different answer, by the way.
Of the president may be. I will tell you, though, on the issue of corporate tax reform, and I know Gene's written about it, published in the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, I still think that's a big leap. Number one, it would take a Republican Congress united for the first time in a while to give up on this notion of comprehensive tax reform, meaning corporate and individual. That's a big jump. Number two, if you're going to say, and I think from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal editorial boards on all sides of the spectrum, there's an agreement that, as Alan points out, the inversion question is symptomatic of a very non-competitive tax code. We need to reform our tax code. Corporate taxes need to be reformed and lowered to allow us to be competitive. But think about sort of the politics of that. If we're going to allow for the reform and reduction of corporate rates, what about the wage earner? What does that say? In addition to the fact, Alex, as I think someone had mentioned earlier, the small businesses, as Ross was saying, the job generators, most of them in the U.S. are pass-through entities, right? They're subchapter S or LLCs. They don't necessarily fall under a corporate tax reform. We'd have to see Congress move to address that if they wanted to address the job generators as well and the smaller businesses. But again, you're still left with the political question. Wage earners, what are you doing about the working middle class? Are you just going to allow the corporate side to be the beneficiary? So I think, again, tall order.
Well, Gene's maybe going to have a little dissension here, and I know we can start with the tax rates. I mean, you've got POTUS who says, you know, I'm willing to lower to 28% the corporate tax rates. I'm willing to lower to 25% the manufacturing tax rates. If I'm not mistaken, the GOP, they're saying we'd like to have a kind of a flat tax rate of 25%. So there doesn't seem to be a huge difference there. I mean, it's close, right? POTUS being president of the United States, I'm sorry, that's in news talk.
What I tried to write in the Wall Street Journal was just to say that if you looked at the Republican chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, David Camp's proposal, and Barack Obama's, they don't represent everybody on either side, they are closer than you've ever seen Democrats and Republicans. I think the heart of that, of it being close is that one, there's an agreement on bringing the rates down. Two, now, in terms of how you would sell that to the public, you're not going to sell that you're just giving a tax cut to corporate America. You're rationalizing a system. We have a very bad system. People argue about is it territorial or worldwide. It's clearly a hybrid. It's just a really stupid hybrid. You're not going to go all the way the other way, so you're trying to just go from a dumb hybrid to a smart hybrid. And the way to do that is to lower tax, get rid of the tax expenditures, a lot of tax expenditures, lower rates, 28%, 25%. A lot depends on how much you're willing to get rid of. Then I think you have to do something, which is to have a minimum tax on foreign earnings. Now, the beauty of a minimum tax on foreign earnings is it's good because it stops the race to the bottom. And what that means is that if you go to a tax haven, you're still going to have to pay a minimum amount. So if you paid 5% in a tax haven and your minimum tax was, let's say, 17.5%, you'd have to pay another 12.5% back to the United States Treasury that year. Now, that may seem burdensome, but the benefit of it is you fix forever the inversion repatriation issue. Mm-hmm. You pay a minimum amount, and then you can move your money back and forth. That, I think, allows people to say you're stopping the race to the bottom. And I think, I don't know if I disagree with Alan on this, but what you want to do from a policy point of view is you want to have our country's CEOs and CFOs thinking about what's best for productivity, growth, and innovation, not tax arbitrage. Right. The fact that a merger doesn't go through based on a regulatory ruling meant that was all happening for tax reasons. It's kind of an indictment of the merger itself. So we need a permanent fix. Now, let me just say why I want to be a little more optimistic than Eric, or get Eric to be a little more optimistic. The Republicans don't give up on individual tax reform. They just say, let's get this done. Individual tax reform means taking on the tax expenditures for the real estate industry, the health industry. It's going to be charitable. It's going to be very, very difficult. I think the key is that you'd have to try to do something for the S-corps, the pass-through. If you go to lowering the individual rate, it gets very controversial. But you could give lots of incentives for investment, for R&D, for payroll that could help small businesses who are partnerships or S-corps. And I'd sure like to give it a chance because our corporate tax system is broken. And we really ought to fix it. And so maybe I'm being optimistic, but I guess what I wanted to do is just say we're close enough that it's kind of a shame if we don't get this done. And just the last point I make is the problem in Washington, D.C. right now is not that we disagree so much. I don't believe that. I was there at Clinton and Gingrich. We disagreed a lot, too. It's just compromising. You don't ask Eric Cantor and I to agree with each other. You just say, here's something we want enough that we're willing to give you what you want enough. And then the public thinks that's a great win. And that's the kind of tradition that's been lost in D.C.
I've done a lot of work on the need to reform the U.S. corporate tax system. In fact, I worked behind the scenes with the super committee back in 2011. I polled a few overnighters working on that. And if there's one thing that economists agree on is that marginal tax rates matter, and the U.S. corporate tax system is really causing firms to make decisions on tax liabilities and not on economic efficiency. And so, I want to believe, as Gene does, that having talked to many Republican senators and worked on this a few years ago, that don't let the good be the enemy of the perfect. And if we can get some meaningful corporate tax reform, maybe the Republicans say, well, we can get comprehensive tax reform if we capture the presidency in 2016. But it seems to me the Republicans risk being labeled as the party of no. And I know that you're not the party of no, Eric, but certainly others portray you as that. So I see this as an opportunity for the Republicans to be part of governance and not just saying no.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said. If I went down a couple years ago and had a conversation with Gene when he was at the White House and then went over and saw Eric, I would walk back saying, these guys are about 90% the same on what they want to accomplish. And then if somebody said, what are the odds of accomplishing? And I'd say about 0, that the politics get in the way. And I happen to lean towards Eric's way on how hard a sell it will be. The facts tend not to matter when somebody wants to strip out one piece of what was agreed to and hammer that home in every campaign ad that they do. And so I think it's unlikely, but I will point out the corporate tax system is even more broken than people are suggesting. And where I will disagree with what Gene said, AbbVie, after seeing their tax synergies substantially reduced by the Treasury action, still said it's a good deal for us, and then said, but we can't do it because we're getting all of this pressure that we're going to leave the tax jurisdiction. And I will tell you what's going to happen in certain industries, like healthcare. I will guarantee it. As long as the tax...
Are they an independent source about themselves? I'm sorry.
Yeah. But I will guarantee that, and actually some of the political pressure that was put on them, the people that put that pressure came out and said, we did that. And so, but what I will guarantee is that if we don't fix the tax code in certain industries, and this is much more impactful in some industries than others, you will see a large base of U.S. companies in that industry owned by foreign corporations. I've always said that capital is the one thing that does not need a passport to travel across borders. So the advantage, it's not a minor advantage. It's not tax planning and everything else. It's saying two companies have exactly the same business in exactly the same markets, and one of them is able to use its cash flow to do things that the other one can't. They have an advantage that will show up in their ability to buy a company and say, I can earn more from it than they can on their own. So hopefully, if that keeps happening and people realize, see, politically it was harder to say that U.S. company is leaving and becoming a non-U.S. taxpayer, that's terrible. But when a foreign company buys them, you don't say, well, that's terrible, that's okay. It doesn't sound as bad politically, but it ends up worse when their headquarters go as well as their tax domicile. So, but the one thing I think we'd have a shot at if we could get to it, a couple of things. On Gene's point, which when I read his editorial, I was cheered. So on the minimum tax, that will work in certain industries if you could get other governments to go along with it. And if you see what's been happening recently between France and some of these other countries and Ireland, there could be an agreement on a minimum tax amongst the developed countries. which would not be a bad idea to say, let's not have a lot of this move to the 5% tax. But without some sort of harmonization, you're still going to have a gap. And if we're going to go after it, it would be good to flow in on that. One last thing I'll say, I don't actually know where I come out on this, but one thing that occurs to me is that part of the reason this has come up is that a number of other developed countries have changed their tax laws. So it used to be, there were very few places I could go. You didn't want to go to the Cayman Islands or something like that. But going to the UK and places like that is a very, respectable place to be a taxpayer in. I think part of the reason a lot of Europe was able to shift to more territorial is because they have a VAT. And as long as you have the revenues from a VAT, you are capturing a lot of the economic activity that actually does happen within your borders, as opposed to where the company is domiciled or where its IP is and all of those kinds of things. And the last thing I'll say on this, because we spent a lot of time on it, it gets too complicated but incomprehensive from a political point of view. Something I've always been against is taxing capital gains or dividends at the same rate as ordinary income because it's double taxation. But if you bring down the corporate tax rate, you could justify raising capital gains and dividends and say the total rate on what we're taxing in corporate profits is staying roughly the same. And I do think politically the Warren Buffett issue of how do you get wealthy people to have their taxes, actually they're paying a higher rate on their capital and dividends, could be part of the selling point of how to get at this.
So, Alex, if I just comment on that, and Alan put his finger on a point of real contention, though. I mean, this distinction between ordinary and capital income and what it is that we are as a country and whether we should be providing an incentive for risk-based investment. There are a lot of people on Capitol Hill that frankly adhere to that and not so sure that they would go along with raising the capital gains rate if you brought down the ordinary rate. And so there is that difficult
corporate rate.
I mean, the corporate rate, right? The other point, and you and I, Alan, had discussed this a little bit earlier, was the point of revenue neutrality overall in tax reform. If you ask me why we've not seen Washington implement or undertake tax reform successfully, it really starts with that. That's a threshold issue. And Gene will tell you that the White House had certain parameters by which they wanted to operate when you saw tax reform. And in fact, Chairman Camp's draft operated with a different assumption, that revenue neutrality was something that was going to be affected. And there's a threshold issue. So if we're going to be optimistic, which I want to be, there needs to be some resolution on that as well.
And speaking of the optimism, Gene describing a scenario where you've got different political parties all gathered in the same room and you've got 90% in agreement. Do you agree with that? And what is it that makes Alan walk away from hearing that and say, it's never going to happen? And how will that change? What will it take for that to change?
I think it's somewhat, and Alan referred to this in sort of the campaign commercials, the ease with which you can use an issue when it comes to the fight in the campaign. You add to that the robust nature of our primaries, especially when it comes to the House. As you know, the House is fought out in districts. There's probably 40 of them that are typically where the action is, right? But the action tends to draw to the polls because of the way the districts are drawn. But even in the general elections, this issue surrounding the inversions and the president and the administration in terms of their rhetoric about being unpatriotic if CEOs and their boards want to fulfill their fiduciary duties to their shareholders somehow are then labeled unpatriotic. That's a political statement. That is, Alex, the reason I believe there's so much skepticism now is because any move you make that tries to improve the situation could very well, by both sides, either side, be twisted against you in the political arena. And so I think that you're just going to have to see some maturation, if you will, on this issue in that context.
Okay. Let's get quickly, because time is just zipping by here. Long-term structural issues impacting the economy, and it was briefly glossed over with immigration reform. But one example specifically would be, could the H-1B visa for high skills workers, could that be reformed? Could that bring in a greater number of those kinds of workers? Or do we have to do immigration reform in totality? We can't just do it piece by piece. I guess, Eric, first shot at that.
Sure, I know Jean and I have talked about this, I think even last night. I would like to see incremental progress in immigration reform because the comprehensive package, again, is so difficult. Not unlike the discussion on tax reform. As Jean said, why isn't it that we couldn't just take the 90%? Well, H-1B visas is one of those issues that's a bipartisan issue. You know, stapling a green card to a diploma when you have foreign nationals at our universities is something that bipartisan support exists. So yes, I would hope that could get done. Thus far, we haven't seen that happen because there are those who say, well, we can't use that bipartisan issue because we need it to drive the whole package. So at some point, you're right, Alex, if we could see, hey, let's just bank the win right now, put some points on the board, it could be accretive, I think, to the process.
What do you think, Jean?
I think it's difficult, and I'll, you know, I won't hide the reason why. I think that the fact that there are 10, 11 million Americans who, you know, whose children come home from school every day thinking perhaps their mother or father was deported, or that a single auto accident could cost them their family being unified, is a terrible humanitarian issue. I think it's a huge economic issue. I think we have to deal with it. I think while I, in 90% of the time, would agree, let's get stuff done we agree on, in this one case, I think there's something that feels wrong to me to say, we're going to just take care of the high-skilled. We're just going to take all that energy and say we're just going to take care of those issues for our great high-skilled, high-tech companies, which is really important, and leave so many people behind. So in this case, I think that we have to try to figure out some solution. And you want to talk about an issue that people agree on? If you were to get my counterparts, I mean the Republicans who've been in my jobs in Republican administrations, those economists, they would agree with everything. They agree, every respectable Republican and Democrat economist in the United States agrees that immigration reform overall would be good for growth, would be good for deficit reduction, it would increase revenues, and be good for productivity. So this is one place I would like to see us come together. I do think we as a country need to pass immigration reform, but I also believe that we should do that in combination with a much stronger effort to get more young people from lower income backgrounds up to graduate from college. It is the one thing that really affects economic mobility in our country. It's very sad, but if you're in the bottom 20% of our country, by the accident of your birth, you're about 70% likely to stay in the bottom 20 to 40%, unless you graduate from college. Then you have the same chance of being in the top 20% as the bottom 20%. So an effort to get kids through college and get immigration reform, that is a strong skill-based strategy for our country. I wish that would go higher on our economic agenda.
Yeah. What about, Annette, I'd like you to pull up slides 20 through 22 and run them. To Ross, the shale oil, the gas boom that we've got going on here, how much could that reduce U.S. dependence on foreign oil and increase U.S. competitiveness in manufacturing?
Well, I think it could do a lot. I don't think Europeans fully quite comprehend the extent of the revolution in oil and gas exploration in the United States, especially you look at oil. The United States is producing 4 million barrels of oil a day, more than it did 5 years ago. And it's a tremendous increase. And of course, that is reducing the oil import bill in the United States. And one of the reasons why I'm a bit more optimistic that the rising dollar won't affect U.S. trade performance, at least the deficit, as much as you might think. And it's also, I mean, think back 10, 20 years ago, if we had a crisis in the Middle East, people being beheaded in Syria, Americans, people from the UK, oil prices would have shot up. Why hasn't that happened this time? Well, it's partly because the US is producing a lot more oil. And for competitiveness, I think this is one of the real jewels that the United States has on the natural gas side. We've already seen this. The dependence on electric generation that comes from coal has declined significantly because natural gas prices have come down. In Europe, you're talking about $14 per million BTUs. In Japan, it's 16. In the United States, it's plus or minus 4. So you're actually seeing fertilizer producers that had operations in the Middle East come to the United States to build factories. I grew up in Ohio, and if you'd have told me that we'd had another steel plant built in Steubenville, Ohio, I would have said you were absolutely insane. But they built it right on the edge of the Marcellus Shale, natural gas there, and they just tapped into it. And for many manufacturing processes, especially energy-intensive ones, the United States becomes a much more attractive option. So I think that is something that's underappreciated, and it's certainly a job creator. I would like to see a few more pipelines built. I used to work for a railroad. I worked for 2 railroads, actually, 2 of the largest in the United States. And look, railroads are relatively safe, but they are using a lot of older tank cars to haul crude oil around the country. And Canada, a year ago had a large accident. I'm somewhat concerned. I think it would be safer if we were to have a few more pipelines hauling that oil around as opposed to on the U.S. rail system.
So Alex, on that, I agree with everything Ross just said, but one counter trend that we just refuse to deal with is if you went back to when we were the most dependent on foreign oil, at that point in time, our infrastructure, as measured by like the World Economic Forum for how good it is for doing business, we were ranked in the top 3 in the world for infrastructure if you were looking to locate facilities in the United States. Well, we have now dramatically improved in our energy self-sufficiency, which is a huge positive for where people want to put their capital. Our infrastructure is now ranked in the latest ranking something like 26th or 27th in the world. Now try to find 25 countries that you think would likely be an easier place to do business than the United States. So if we really want to get investment going, we have so much capital looking for a home, we have labor looking for jobs, but you want to put money into projects that won't create temporary jobs. You want them to lead to long-term jobs, which is bring more activity here, put the money into infrastructure. And this is another one of those things that I cannot find anybody on either side of the aisle that thinks we shouldn't be doing it. And we are still sitting here, 5 years later saying, well, it'd be a nice thing to do.
Alex, there'll be an opportunity for the new Congress to take that up because, as you know, we saw Washington just basically kick the can until about May of next year on the Highway Reauthorization Act. And I do think, Alan, you're right. There's bipartisan support. The question's always been just the same as Gene and I were about in summer of 2011, trying to find how you pay for whatever it is we're trying to accomplish. But I do think that there will be a great opportunity. It could be a big win for the Congress if they figured out some certainty as to how we're going to really dedicate ourselves to investment in infrastructure, perhaps with a greater private sector participation.
Yeah, Secretary Pritzker has identified that there is a ton of private sector money that would come in. The government should be in the game too, but if you bring in the private sector, you could say, therefore, the private sector is validating that the return on this, and we're not throwing money down a hole because the return on this investment, they're going to have to see from user fees and economic activity, not from saying, oh, sorry, we missed up on that. So I think the current administration has, under Secretary Pritzker, has the right ideas, but it just is frustrating that we don't go forward on some of these.
I want to quickly get to you, Jean, on the efficacy of the Dodd-Frank bill. It's been in effect for just a couple months, over 4 years now. The drawbacks that were voiced at its inception around its passage, have they been realized, or do you think that the issue of transparency has done a good thing for the American consumer and thereby everyone globally?
Look, when you try to do something as major as that, you're trying to get the right balance. And if you're in the administration, that means you're getting hit from the corporate community at times that things are too difficult, and you're getting hit from progressives that you haven't broken up large banks, et cetera. And what you're trying to do is, make sure you have a single resolution authority, make sure you have greater transparency. I think overall, I think it's been a positive thing. I'm sure it will be a work in progress. You don't start something that major, but you have to try to, it's like with housing, it's like with anything else. You have to try to get the balance right and yet not go so far that you constrain this recovery by either uncertainty or unreasonably high capital requirements. So, and I think that you find I have found more people who have resisted realizing that at this point they'd like to just implement what exists and get to having the greater certainty for just moving forward.
Eric, your thoughts on that?
There is actually a lot of bipartisan legislation that has worked its way through the House and the Senate that could likely be a success story for lame duck even, or if not, in the next Congress. And a lot of it has to do with sort of end-user exemption on the derivative side. There is carve-outs for small businesses so as not to come under the sort of burdensome regulation and cost that apply to the big businesses. Again, things that were sort of common sense that may have been an overreach or disproportionate in terms of the impact under Dodd-Frank.
Okay. Look at that flashing red 000. We are out of time. I don't know what's going to happen.
Don't say that too loud.
Yeah, I know. What a great discussion. I'm sure you all enjoyed it. I'm going to give a round of applause to these fabulous gentlemen, Eric, Ross, Alan, Jean. So, thank you.